For the first time since Democrats have taken control of the U.S. House, right now, moments ago, a bill to impeach President Trump just reached the House floor. Now, that itself is unusual, and what happened next was also striking. Speaker Pelosi leading Democrats to unite with Republicans, as you see right here, right now, to squash this effort, voting down this bill to impeach President of the United States, Donald Trump, by 332 to 95. These numbers just came in, breaking. The debate comes amidst deep tensions as the House just formally rebuked Donald Trump last night for, quote, racist comments. Now, as the House barrels towards new rebukes of Trump officials as well on the floor tonight, which we will get to, this impeachment measure came from liberal Congressman Al Green. Now, he seized the momentum from that rebuke of Trump last night to effectively cross Speaker Pelosi and her entire strategy here and argue now is the time to impeach President Trump. This move comes as Bob Mueller's testimony looms next week. And these 95 Democrats who sided with Green tonight, I could tell you that actually marks a slightly larger coalition than the 85 members of the House Democratic Caucus who have previously called for impeaching Donald Trump since the release of the Mueller report. Now, there are those who stress that Congressman Green's catch-all resolution, which was just voted on, doesn't specifically go into a full treatment of obstruction and the other issues that came out of the Mueller report. But to even see this vote happen is unusual. You know, Presidents Nixon and Clinton faced impeachment probes, but Nixon was never actually faced with a floor vote to impeach. These votes are rare. In fact, if you check, the last one came from liberal Congressman Dennis Kucinich in a proposal to impeach President Bush, and it was just farmed out to committee. So consider what tonight's vote marks. Anything can happen in the future or after Mueller testifies next week. But as of right now, I can tell you this news. Less than half of the Democrats in Congress will even move forward on a vote for a bill to launch an impeachment probe of President Trump. It's 40% to be exact, to say nothing of actually potentially later finding the president guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors. So for all the talk of extremes and division, you can think of tonight's news like this. It's President Trump and his Republican defenders of his race-baiting attacks who are looking quite extreme right now this week. And it is Speaker Pelosi and now the majority of her caucus on record that look either gun-shy, if you ask Green and the progressives, or measured, if you ask the Speaker, who says now is not the time for her party to devolve into a debate over removing Trump from office. This is a fast and fluid story, and so I want to bring in our panel, and we'll update anything as it happens. Former federal prosecutor John Flannery, a special counsel in multiple congressional probes, Danielle Gibbs-Leger of the Center for American Progress, and Melissa Murray, NYU law professor. She was a clerk to Judge Sotomayor, and E.J. Dionne, a columnist for The Washington Post. John Flannery, 40% of Democrats come out to the floor tonight moments ago and say, yes, there should be some sort of impeachment probe. The majority of Democrats and all the Republicans say no. What does that tell you about where the Congress is tonight?
Well, from the Democratic side, I think the reaction is they've broken faith with their own base for all their talk about the other base, Mr. Trump's base. I also think that it's a shame that they didn't at least refer to the Judiciary Committee. And it is ironic in terms of contradiction that on day one, we can say that this man is unfit for office because he's a racist and not think that that is a high crime or misdemeanor. And it was identified in Congressman Green's resolution as a high misdemeanor, and I agree. And it didn't require us to wait and see what Mueller was going to say because it's separate and apart from all the other charges, obstruction and otherwise, we've been concerned about. But it does hit a key point. From the moment he walked down his golden escalator, he was a racist. He's been that before he announced. He's been that while he's been the president. And if this nation that made a promise we were all equal as we work toward perfecting this Constitution and are failing to do so with this president, what better reason do we have to deny him the chief executive position in our government? So I think Green was right, and I think they should have at least referred it to the committee so the committee could decide to amend it and add other causes or act on that one alone.
Daniela, your reaction to Speaker Pelosi siding with the Republicans tonight on this vote?
I'm sure she wouldn't classify it as siding with the Republicans. I think she would.
But that's what it is.
But I know that is effectively what happened.
I mean, what does it take to get bipartisanship on the House floor? Apparently, it takes 2 by 4 legally or constitutionally that you swing at President Trump, and then a bunch of Democrats say that's too far.
I mean, no one should be surprised by what happened tonight. We knew that Nancy Pelosi wasn't going to support impeachment right now, and we knew that most of the Democratic members weren't going to support it right now either. I mean, look, this is a very tough position that she's in, and I think the longer that the Democratic base perceives that nothing is happening on the Hill, the harder it's going to be. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be impeachment, but it needs to be some sort of heat, some sort of fire towards this administration so that it doesn't seem like they're just getting away with everything. So I think, the contempt vote with Barr, that's a good step. But the problem is that the perception is that not enough is happening and that Trump and his cronies are getting away with everything.
Professor, and then EJ.
Yeah.
I think Danielle's exactly right. I don't disagree with anything that John has said, but I think one of the things that Speaker Pelosi was trying to avoid today is getting into a really protracted battle with the Republicans about whether or not racist tweets constitute high crimes or misdemeanors for purposes of impeachment. And that's something that we've never actually decided. It's a really broad constitutional term. Congress has interpreted it broadly in the past, but never to include Twitter.
Oh. And Ari,
Well,
I think you
yeah, go ahead, EJ.
Oh, I was going to say, I think you underscored something important at the beginning of the show. That 95 is bigger than the number we thought was for impeachment. So clearly, sentiment is growing in that direction. I think for a lot of members, a freshman I talked to a couple of months ago said, look, there are plenty of grounds to impeach Donald Trump. And the purpose of impeachment is to send a message that this is unacceptable behavior. What he was worried about was not the politics of it, although there is obviously politics here, and there are 31 House members sitting on seats that Trump carried. But he said the politics isn't the issue. The problem is, if we ever got to an impeachment vote and passed it, what message would an acquittal in the Senate send? Would that actually say, no, this is all acceptable? So I think
Well, but
there are a
let me
lot of
push you.
Democrats.
Let me push
Yeah.
you on that, and we have two constitutional scholars with us who know more than I do, and maybe even more than EJ. I think the counter argument to that, EJ, is that would be doing something and not everything. And Al Green is arguing that now the House is on record basically doing close to nothing in his view. And let me play a little bit of Congressman Green on the urgency for everyone's response, starting with EJ. Take a look.
Why not wait until after Special Counsel Mueller's testimony?
Because that's justice delayed. We cannot wait. As we wait, we risk having the blood of somebody on our hands, and it could be a member of Congress.
EJ?
Yeah, no, it's a powerful statement. I suspect that if you privately ask the 137, I think that was the number who voted to table, does Trump deserve to be impeached? The overwhelming number of them would say yes. I think their question is, will we look like we're rushing into something that we want to look like we're doing deliberately? But number two, what's going to happen at the end of the line? If he should be acquitted by the Senate, does that strengthen him politically? But I think in their heart of hearts, an awful lot of these Democrats would just love to throw Trump out of office.
Well, and you say would love to do it. Also, the question in their constitutional duties is whether they think he has committed high crimes and misdemeanors. Certainly a lot of people around him through the judicial process have been found guilty, have been found to be at least felonious. Let me do a lightning round and then come back around. Do you agree or not with EJ's statement that there are far more members of the Democratic caucus who think Trump has done impeachable acts but didn't vote for it today? Daniela, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree.
Professor, do you agree?
Yes.
Flannery?
I don't know what it means if you don't have any commitment consciously. I can't read their minds.
A fair answer. Resisting the frame like any good quibbling lawyer.
That's what I do.
And now going around with,
Never answer the question.
now going around with more
I did, I
time.
think.
What are the Democratic voters supposed to take from that, Daniela? Because you go around and you talk to folks. There are many people who say Donald Trump's full pattern of behavior, the 5 to 6 incidents where Mueller said there was substantial evidence of crimes committed in office, the race baiting, the attacks, the racist comments, to quote the House resolution last night, a lot of other things, the campaign finance violations that Michael Cohen admitted to, that Trump didn't get in trouble for. Take it all together, what are voters supposed to make of their leaders saying, yeah, he did all these things and maybe Obama would have gotten in more trouble, but he gets a pass?
Yeah, I think it's a problem, and they're going to have to figure it out. I mean, look, you have to be honest with voters. Like, honestly, is the Senate going to vote to get rid of Trump? Probably not under Mitch McConnell. But that is not an excuse, and that is not a reason, if you truly believe that he has committed impeachable offenses, to not move forward with impeachment. Because if that's just the reason why we're not going to do anything, then what's going to stop the next president from just doing whatever they want?
Professor, and then Flannery.
I think Nancy Pelosi is in danger of losing control of her caucus. I think you have a lot of moderate Democrats who are going to have to go back to their districts over the recess and have town hall meetings. And there are going to be some very angry progressive constituents who want to know why they voted to table this. And I think that's what Nancy Pelosi had hoped to avoid. And that is what squarely landed on her plate today.
My turn?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, she's dished a large component of her caucus. She has sided with Republicans. They give lip service to the fact that no person is above the law, when plainly they don't invoke the law in any instance against his violations of law, Constitution, racism, demeanor, you name it. And if we had a trial in the Senate and McConnell let it happen, the public would get to see the evidence, or they would see more misconduct that would inform how they vote. And if you remember, Clinton may not have been convicted in the Senate, but we couldn't succeed with another Democratic president. And I think a large part of it was because of what happened with Clinton.
I want you all to
agree with you
hang,
on the
EJ, hang with me. I have a member of Congress with me. You guys stay. I want to hear more from you. But we're talking so much about searching the hearts and minds, if you will. Let's go and listen directly. California Congresswoman Jackie Speier serves on the Oversight and Intelligence Committees. I don't think, take a backseat to many in your disagreements and professional criticism with Donald Trump. But I understand you voted against this. Why?
So I voted to table it for a very specific reason. This particular resolution to impeach was based on his racist comments and that alone. What we are about to hear next week from the special counsel to lay it out to the American people are the reasons I believe that the president should be impeached. That was not included in this resolution. So I do think that your former guests were a little too aggressive in thinking that somehow the Democratic caucus is splitting from Speaker Pelosi. I don't think that's the case at all.
Well, I think what the guests are referring to, Congresswoman, is this is the first time impeachment has gotten to the floor. If it was set up to be tabled or to be squashed or set up to fail, I think the criticism, and I'll allow you to respond to it on behalf of yourself or the thinking of leadership if you wish, is that it's not been teed up to have a Mueller-related vote. Now there's been one vote to table, and the Speaker has not said, to my knowledge, that there's going to be a Mueller-related impeachment vote after Wednesday either. So I suppose, what is the response to that?
So my response to that is let's have the hearing where we can hear 4 hours or 5 hours of Bob Mueller talking about that report to the American people. I think there's many of us who have already gone on record that we want to initiate an impeachment inquiry for the Judiciary Committee, and many of those members did not vote for this impeachment resolution. High crimes and misdemeanors. I mean, there's no question that this president has made racist comments. I believe that he is racist, but that alone is not sufficient, I believe, to impeach him. I think a cover-up, obstructing justice, working with the Russians to intervene in the election, cooperating with the Russians, tacitly conspiring with the Russians, those are all reasons I believe that we would be willing to impeach.
You mentioned what you described as the president's racist comments, and of course I was quoting the resolution earlier. He says this is all working, which is quite a statement, that he's winning. Take a listen to the president saying that this is all the way he wanted it to go down this week.
I do think I'm winning the political fight. I think I'm winning it by a lot. I think that they are not espousing the views of our country, the 4 congresswomen. I think that they've said horrible things that the press doesn't cover.
Congresswoman?
Well, my response to that is this is not about winning, and that's where the president is. He doesn't want to do any policy work. The American people expect us to come together, negotiate, and come up with some solutions. I've started to hashtag stop tweeting, start leading, because I'm tired of responding to every horrendous tweet that he puts out, and he puts out 3 or 4 a day, and we end up responding to that and not sitting down and trying to negotiate reducing the cost of prescription drugs, building more infrastructure, and getting rid of corruption. Those are the things that the American people want us to engage in.
I don't want to make light of anything, but it's always that paradox these days on the internet. If you're tweeting about not tweeting, where does that get you? Although hashtags can spread and inspire the better angels of our nature to think more and perhaps tweet less, or at least retweet some of the bile that has come out of the White House Twitter account. Before I let you go, there's this thing that happens, I think you know about it with the news. Obviously, I told my viewers at the top how rare it is to even have a floor vote on impeachment. This was the first one since your party took office. So that's a big story. And yet it's not the only thing going on, as you know, Congresswoman, in a very formal way, with teeth that could matter in litigation. You and your colleagues are moving forward tonight on these votes to hold other Trump officials in contempt. Walk us through what that means, why that's important, what it would achieve.
Well, why that's important is that the oversight function of our oversight committee has been thwarted by the president, who's basically telling all of the administration officials not to cooperate with requests for depositions and hearings. And in particular, the census issue is one where the president thinks he's winning because he has now chilled many people in this country from participating in the census. He didn't get his question on the census that asks whether or not you were a U.S. citizen. That's important because states like California could, in fact, lose hundreds of millions of dollars in just one program. The program as it relates to federal funding for roads. It's a $5 billion pot of money that is based almost exclusively on the census. So I think that the American people are tired of all of this. I don't blame them. I'm tired of it too. But what we need to do is try and get the president refocused on leadership, which means sitting down with us and negotiating some of these thorny issues.
Congresswoman Speier, on this busy night with all these votes, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ari.
What I'm going to do now is reset with one final lightning round. We heard our panelists told by this member of Congress they were too aggressive, some of them. Now, Flannery, I think it was mostly for you, but what do I know? Can't read minds. That's the theme tonight. So final lightning round. I'm told my producer's telling me I have, 80 seconds left, but you just heard the member of Congress. Each of you, in a sentence or two, any response and what's important for Congress going from here on this historic night, starting with Flannery.
They have to stop being a congressional cream puff, and even if they hold people in contempt, actually do something about it afterwards, just like all the promises they made to do something and they failed to do. Sorry if I went too long.
Daniela?
I don't know that I'd use the word cream puffs, but I do agree that they need to put some teeth behind their actions.
EJ?
Hold them in contempt, have hearings, build a case, and then have this vote sometime down the road.
Professor?
I said what I said, and I'll keep saying it. I don't know that this was the hill to die on, but I do think that what happened today shows that Speaker Pelosi is losing some of the momentum that she had in holding this caucus together.
Interesting. And I think that point that you raised, which is somewhere between the moral debate and the procedural one, is tonight was going to be about some other things. And as you say, there was enough pressure that this vote went forward rather than just shutting it down. She didn't want to appear to shut it down, but she did hold the vote. So now everyone knows a little bit of where the flank is in the impeachment debate in the intramural part of the Democratic caucus. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.